Thank you so much for coming this evening. I want to thank you for coming. Some of you already know me. Most of you already know me. I'm Danny Sheehan. I am the... I think that's a cheer for my still being around. Many of you probably remember me most as being for 20 years the president and the chief counsel of the Christic Institute. More specifically, perhaps some of you as when I was chief counsel in the Iran-Contra case, in which we filed the major federal criminal racketeering lawsuit against the off-the-shelf enterprise of Oliver North and Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, and brought to an end the illegal smuggling of weapons to the Contras in Central America. And others of you may remember me as the chief counsel in the Karen Silkwood case, in which we brought the major federal civil rights action against the people who killed Karen Silkwood back in 1974, when she was on her way to deliver documents from the Kerr-McGee Nuclear Corporation to the New York Times, revealing the fact that the company had been smuggling 98% pure bomb-grade plutonium to the state of Israel and to Iran, under the Shah of Iran, as well as to South Africa, which is the song that you heard here, no rope as long as time. And that you'll recall that we won the $10.5 million judgment against the Kerr-McGee Nuclear Corporation for their having contaminated Karen in her home, the largest civil judgment in the history of the United States as of that time. But more importantly, we won the ruling that declared unconstitutional the effort on the part of Congress that was in complicity with the private nuclear industry that attempted to pass a statute setting a maximum cap on the amount of money that an American jury could return as a judgment against a private corporation for releasing radioactive materials into their neighborhood. And from that point forward, when the cap was declared unconstitutional, not a single new nuclear power plant was bought or built in the United States for 35 years. Now others of you may remember the Christic Institute as having represented the people in the American sanctuary movement that were arrested by the federal authorities during the Reagan and Bush administration for assisting people fleeing from Central America, from the death squads in El Salvador and Guatemala, when the churches and synagogues had joined together and established sanctuaries here in the United States for political refugees to seek asylum here in the United States. In the federal administration under the Reagan-Bush administration, arrested them and charged them with aiding and abetting undocumented aliens. That we won not only the dismissal of all of the charges against them, but the ruling from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals declaring illegal any further arrests of people from the American sanctuary movement. And more recently, people from Santa Cruz probably remember me from being invited to teach at the university, to teach the course on the alternative theories of the Kennedy assassination during the 50-year anniversary, because I happened to be part of the legal office at the law office of F. Lee Bailey in Boston when we represented James McCord, who was the Watergate burglar who blew the whistle on Richard Nixon and actually revealed the existence of the White House plumbers unit and led to the articles of impeachment being returned against Richard Nixon in his resignation in 1974. So prior to that class, I was privileged to be invited to teach the course at the university called 8 Cases That Changed America, in which I was able to convey to the members of the new millennial generation the details of other cases that we were privileged to participate in, such as the Pentagon Papers case, where we won the United States Supreme Court decision authorizing the New York Times to publish the content of all 47 volumes of the Pentagon Papers, revealing the pattern of lies and deception and aggressive warfare that was mounted on the part of the United States in violation of the Geneva Accords of 1954, and led to a more rapid conclusion to the war in Vietnam. And there were other cases that I got to share that I was legal counsel on, such as, for example, the Wounded Knee occupation case back in 1974, where we represented and defended the members of the American Indian movement that, in fact, resulted in the dismissal of all of the charges against the members of the American Indian movement who seized Wounded Knee. But in all of those cases, when I got to come to Santa Cruz from our offices in Washington, D.C., I was meeting with you at that time to ask for your support for individual cases like that, asking for you to make public the existence of our lawsuits so that the American people would know what was going on and that the judges that were sitting on those cases would know that the whole world was watching, so that they would be mandated to abide by the rules that would enable us to win those cases. Or we were asking you to contact Congress and ask Congress to convene hearings, for example, in the Karen Silkwood case, to look into what had happened to Karen Silkwood and what was going on in the private nuclear industry, et cetera. Or to hold hearings in the Iran-Contra case, to appoint the Special Select Committee on Iran-Contra to investigate those cases. We were fortunate in having your support for all those years to aid us in both shining the light on the courtroom so the judges would abide by the rules and pressuring the members of Congress to hold hearings and stop the conduct that we were suing the people over. The problem is that I've come here tonight to talk with you about is the fact that both of those avenues are now basically closed to us. With regard to the United States Congress, as you know, in the House of Representatives, the 435 seats that are held in the House of Representatives, of the 435 seats, 200 are held by Democrats and 233 are held by Republicans. And the real challenge is that among those 233 Republicans, there are 38 hardcore reactionaries that are now in the House of Representatives who have taken it into mind to basically paralyze the federal government, to bring them to a standstill, to try to shrink the federal government, cutting back on all federal programs so that they can shrink the government to the size of so they can be drowned in a bathtub, in the terms of some of them, as they say. And so that these 38 members of Congress, the reactionary members of Congress, are actually holding hostage all of the other legislators in the House of Representatives so that no progressive legislation can be passed, no liberal legislation can be passed. Indeed, not even any moderate legislation can be passed. And as it turns out, over the past few years, not even any merely conservative legislation can be passed. Even legislative proposals that have been endorsed by John Boehner, the majority leader for the Republicans, are being opposed by these 38 members of the House. And so the House of Representatives in the present state has basically been paralyzed, not allowing them to basically pass any legislation to attempt to deal with two of the major issues we're going to be talking about tonight. On the Senate side, as we know, there are 100 seats in the Senate, and the fact is that in the Senate, as we now know, there are 45 of the 100 seats that are held by Republicans and 55 seats held by the Democrats. And so one might say to oneself, well, wait a second, if the Democrats have a 55 to 45 majority, can't they get something passed in the Senate? That might be possible, except for the fact that the Democratic majority that's in charge of the United States Senate has now passed a rule governing the rules of the Senate that require 60 votes to be in hand, committed to stopping a filibuster before they will even bring a bill to the floor. And so that no legislation, no progressive legislation, liberal legislation, even moderate legislation can be brought to the floor of the Senate unless 60 votes are already in hand committed to vote for cloture, to shut down a filibuster. So for that reason, there are 13 members of the United States Senate who are hardcore reactionaries who in fact threaten to filibuster virtually every piece of legislation. And so the Democrats fold in the face of that and say, well, listen, there's going to be a filibuster, so unless we can get now 5 of the Republicans to come on board with us, to join so that we have 55, we need to have 5 Republicans, and so the Republicans just refuse to cooperate. And so the Democrats then refuse to bring any of the legislation to the floor. So the present status of the United States Congress is that we're basically frozen in place so that no matter how much lobbying or contacting of your congresspeople or the senator to try to get them to do something, they're just going to respond to you by saying, hey, look, there's nothing we can do. And so one might hope that that would be cured this November. On November 4th, there are elections, general elections, for all 435 seats in the House, and for a third of the United States Senate. And the present condition of the House, which is now, as I said, 233 Republicans to 200 Democrats, when they get all done shuffling around and playing, as it turns out of the 435 seats, only 66 seats in the entire United States House of Representatives are even competitive, because both parties have gerrymandered the districts to such an extent that it's absolutely a foregone conclusion that that party is going to win that congressional seat. And so there's no competition in any but 66 seats. And in those 66 seats, I've done a hard analysis of this, and of those 66 seats, 36 are held by Republicans and 30 by Democrats. But the fact of the matter is that the Republicans, out of those 36 seats, are only going to lose 1 seat. They're going to lose the 31st congressional district here in the state of California, Gary Miller's seat. The Democrats are going to take that seat back. But the problem is, of the 30 seats that the Democrats have that are vulnerable, they're going to lose 2 to 4 of those. And so when all the pushing and shoving is completed in November, the 233 seats that the Republicans now hold are probably going to go up to 234 or 235, and the 200 seats that the Democrats have are probably going to go down to 199. So you can see that there's basically nothing happening on that front. There's no likelihood that we're going to be able to penetrate into the Congress to get them to do anything for us. We know on the Senate side, which you're hearing a lot of conversations about right now, the fact of the matter is that the 55 to 45 advantage that the Democrats have right now is going to go down. That they're going to lose 3 of the seats, one of which is in South Dakota, that we've just been talking about here in the reception beforehand. South Dakota is going to lose that seat to the Republicans. They're going to lose the seat in Montana, and they're almost certainly going to lose the seat that Jay Rockefeller has had for 5 terms in West Virginia. So 3 of those seats are going to be lost right away, and the problem is that in addition, so that there's 6 seats. If the Republicans take 6 seats, they would take over the United States Senate, that they would have control of the House and the United States Senate. So there's 3 seats already of the 6 that are going to be lost, and that 2 additional seats are held by first-term Democrats that came in back in 2008 when Obama was elected. Now we have to think back. It seems like a long time ago, but that was just 2008, one Senate term of 6 years, that 2 of the United States senators came to power on that big sweep that brought in Barack Obama. This is North Carolina and Alaska. And both of those seats are in very serious jeopardy right now. Both of those first-term senators are trailing their Republican opponent right now by approximately 48% to 41%. So that it's a very serious problem. If both of those seats are lost by the Democrats, in addition to the other 3, that's going to put it right at a 50-50 split in the United States Senate, with the House of Representatives still staying under control of the Republicans, but basically by 233 to 200. So there's not any realistic expectation that we can expect much from the Democrats. And if either one of 2 additional seats, that is Arkansas and Louisiana, are lost, either one of those seats, the Republicans take the control of the Senate. I personally don't believe that's going to happen. I believe that it's going to be very tight, and I believe that it may come down to 51-49, with the Democrats still controlling. The problem is that the Democrats still have that same rule, that without 60 votes, they will not bring anything to the floor. And so instead of having to only get 5 Republicans to agree with them, they're going to have 7 to 9, which is not going to happen. So I point this out to suggest that the long history that we've all shared together down through the years of attempting to reach out to the members of Congress to try to get them to hold hearings, to try to get them to help us, to get legislation passed, et cetera, and to all work together collectively at this sort of this advance guard, this vanguard theory of social change, that we somehow, as an elite, well-educated community here in Santa Cruz and other places around the country, can reach out to our congressional representatives and get them to make the fix from the top. That isn't likely to happen. And so therefore, the Democratic Party is basically going to be holding on by its fingernails to a completely dysfunctional Senate, thinking that that's a big victory. And then they're going to put all of their eggs in the basket of having Hillary Clinton win the presidency in 2016. And so she's going to have a completely locked down House of Representatives run by the reactionaries and a Senate which is completely dysfunctional. And what's going to happen is they're going to start drifting more and more back toward the right, the Democratic Party, to try to establish an alliance with the conservatives so that they can isolate the reactionaries in the Republican Party and can tell everybody that the Republican Party are just a bunch of reactionaries. And now the Democrats are the responsible conservatives. And so what we're going to be faced with now in the post-Cold War realignment of the 2 political parties is the Democrats now taking on the mantle of the conservatives, both domestically and internationally, in trying to isolate the Republicans as reactionaries, which the Republicans are quite willing to do. And so that avenue for any type of progressive social change, in view of the serious problems that we're going to be talking about tonight, is of virtually no potential assistance to us. So the question arises, what about the other venue that we used to use with the Christic Institute of going to the courts, bringing major litigation in coming out and meeting with you around the country and having you mobilize and make public the existence of this case so that the judges could be pressured into abiding by the rules? The reality is, as we know right now, when W. Bush ended up leaving after 2 terms, that the percentage of the judges that had been appointed by Richard Nixon, had been appointed by Gerald Ford, had been appointed by Ronald Reagan in 2 terms, had been appointed by George H.W. Bush, had been appointed by George W. Bush for 2 terms, they constituted over 65% of all of the members of the federal judiciary. And when Obama came into office, What happened is that all of his nominees for the federal bench, and there were 102 vacancies on the federal benches, and the fact is that without having 60 votes committed to breaking a filibuster, he couldn't get virtually any of those people approved. If they turned out that they'd been a member of the American Civil Liberties Union, that was it. They were dead. If they were members of the National Organization for Women, they were dead. They couldn't get appointed. If they basically read more than 2 books a year, they couldn't get approved, because all they needed to have 5 Republicans in the Senate who would break ranks and agree that they would close a filibuster against them. So what we see now is, with the retirement of members of the bench who were appointed way back by Jimmy Carter or by Bill Clinton, that the percentage of federal judges now sitting on the bench that are right-wing Republican judges is 70%. And that they now have complete control over 10 of the 12 federal circuit courts. So even if, in fact, you can find a good federal district court judge on the trial level and win the case, it'll go up to the Court of Appeals and they'll just lock down on it. Because it turns out that 46% of all of those Republican appointees are members of the Federalist Society. And the Federalist Society was organized with the self-conscious intention of imposing reactionary views in the courts. And so that particular avenue is not functionally open to us any longer. And it doesn't do any good for us to pretend, to say, here, let's rush in and file our litigation and just spend our time climbing over the top of one of these hostile judges and then go up and get disemboweled at the Court of Appeals. You know, I mean, that isn't gaining anybody anything. In fact, it's actually establishing bad precedents. And so we see now, of course, the decision in Bush v. Gore. We saw what happened. I mean, they didn't pay the slightest bit of attention to what the law really required. They just basically put Bush in power. And the same thing with Citizens United. I mean, we don't have to all make each other feel bad by reviewing them one at a time. But I mean, with Citizens United, now corporations are viewed as being people, and that therefore they're vested with the same constitutional rights. So therefore, they can basically contribute money to campaigns and participate like any other citizen and be protected. And in fact, now as of 2 days ago, in the McCutcheon case, the same court, 5-4, the same 5 justices, have now struck down the maximum cap put on what the amount is a wealthy individual can put into campaigns. So now, in the next step that's going to be coming is that corporations, since they're people too, can put in as much money as they want. So they can actually resort to the actual corporate treasury to start financing campaigns directly. And so so that is compounding our problem, that not only do we have these terrible judges, but that we have the Senate and the House closed down, and now it's going to be even worse. So I'm just putting that in front of us because this is the situation that we face as the major secular crisis of the 21st century comes upon us. Now, that's what I want to address tonight, with the full recognition that we're not going to be able to run out and sue somebody to help stop these problems. And we're not going to be able to go get Congress to run to our aid and help us on these solve these problems. But this global secular crisis that's coming upon us, I want to just briefly point out that my thesis as the president and former chief counsel of the Christic Institute, and as the president now and general counsel for the Romero Institute based here in Santa Cruz, that what I've come to tell you is that we have to mobilize to do something about this, because we can no longer rely upon the courts or the Congress to protect us. Okay? And so So this is a community organizing gathering that we're doing here in Santa Cruz. And it's my thesis that two of the major issues that we can uniquely address here in Santa Cruz. First thing is the onrushing global climate change. And the second one is the ever-ascending national security state that we see coming upon the country. And what I want to talk about tonight is how these two things are going to interface with each other to pose an extraordinary problem for our American people unless we move very quickly. Let me parenthetically point out for a moment what I mean by this secular crisis. That some of you have heard me mention this before. I know some of my students have up on the Hill. The fact is that a major work was prepared back in 1991 by two major sociologists, William Strauss and Neil Howe from Harvard and Yale. They were major sociologists. They did a major empirical study, and what they concluded is that in every 100-year cycle in the United States, here in North America, every 100 years, there are understandably 4 generations that are born, basically from 21 to 25 years each. And in each of those 100-year cycles, there's one of those generations that is an idealist generation. And the idealist generation basically absorbs and comes to believe all of the highest ideals that have been espoused by our country, by Western civilization, by our human family. And that they absorb these ideals and they go forward believing that they're real. And that this idealist generation is born at the very conclusion of the previous secular crisis from the previous 100-year cycle. And it is because of the successful resolution of that crisis that these children are born into this atmosphere of growing optimism and a rising sense of elan, that everything can be successful and everything can be accomplished. And so therefore they grow up their first 18 years as children basically believing that the ideals can be made real. And then there is a period for 10 years, and when they turn 18 years old, they come out into the world as adults, and this idealist generation comes to discover, lo and behold, that these ideals are not in fact being adhered to. And that therefore the idealists are challenged by the fact that they think they've been lied to by their previous parents' generation, that it's not true, that all people are born, or believe that there's not a belief that people are born equal. There's not a belief that you ought to be able to speak freely and say what it is you believe. It's not true that good will always be rewarded. It's not true that people are going to all have equal say in the political decision-making process. These ideals are not only not true, but it turns out that their parents don't even believe they were true. And so that generation is confronted with a challenge, whether to basically abandon their belief in those ideals and simply join in the power game of doing things the way they're really done and abandoning those basic ideals, or do they stick to their ideals and continue the struggle, even if in fact they only win partial victories and are pushed back constantly? And so that Strauss and Howe, in their book that's called Generations, A History of America's Future, they point out that not surprisingly, our baby boom generation, born between the morning of February 3rd of 1943 and November 22nd of 1963, and everybody who was born after February 3rd of 1943 and before the end of 1963, raise your hand. Okay? A sea of baby boomers. Okay? Now, what they're saying is that the baby boom generation is in fact the idealist generation of this 100-year cycle. And that the idealist generation of the previous 100-year cycle was, in fact, the members of the progressive era. The people that were involved, for example, in the Chautauqua movement, in the establishment of the American Labor Union movement, the women's suffrage movement, the post-Civil War civil rights movement, the original environmental movement, all of those movements that came out of the Chautauqua movement that began in 1889 and went on all the way through to 1920. All of those major progressive changes, the banning of child labor in the mines, et cetera, the free public school system, et cetera, from John Dewey. All of these major movements were generated basically by the progressive era back during that time. And so what they're saying in, Strauss and Howe are saying in their book Generations, is that what they've discovered is that this has happened every 100 years. That the original idealist generation are those that came over originally as the Pilgrims, fleeing from Europe when the major secular crisis that struck in the 15th century, or in the 16th century, when it struck that whole glorious revolution and the whole confrontation against established royalty and the absolute monarchs together in Europe, that entire operation, when the Pilgrims fled from that, they came to North America and saw it as the great shining city on the hill. That it was brother this and sister that, and they owned their property in common. They got along famously with the actual native people that were here. The native people showed them how to plant food and corn with the fish. And there was a whole era in that original idealist generation before that next generation came in that was the reactive generation. Because in every 100-year cycle, the idealist generation is followed by a reactive generation. And they point this out so I just want to close on this minor aside to point out to you that what's happening now with our baby boom generation is exactly what has happened 4 times before. And what they said is their research showed them that what happens is that the idealist generation, when it comes out, when the members come out when they're 18 years old and start confronting the real world, they spend an entire decade confronting the hypocrisy of their previous generations that are not, in fact, following the ideals that have been taught to the idealist generation. They go on for 10 years, and they're pushed back against by the culture. And what they do is they then go into a retrenchment period where they begin to go and seek out what the real sources are of those ideals. And they end up going to India, and they end up going and sitting on top of mountains. They end up going and actually, in 2 different cycles, experimenting with psychedelic drugs, actually. Not any of us. I'm talking about the other members of the generation, and what they do is they come to the discovery that the genuine source of the ideals in which they believe as Americans, the source is fundamentally spiritual. They all come to discover that. And then what happens is that when they get to the age after they've done all of this exploring and discerning what's really been going on in the world, they all come together and they start gathering when they start to turn about 65 to 68 years old. They all start gathering together in groups, small groups at first, then bigger groups, and they start reminiscing together about that halcyon period, that decade. Between 1968 and 1978. That 1968, the halcyon year, the year of the Democratic National Convention, the year in which Bobby Kennedy ran for the presidency but was assassinated, the year in which Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, the year in which we finally got Richard Nixon back to kick around again. That whole beginning of that period, 1968, all the way to 1978, when we had the church committee hearings, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence Abuse, the House Select Committee on the assassination to reinvestigate the assassination, the dismissal of 840 members of the Central Intelligence Agency's Covert Operations Directorate for engaging in criminal conduct. And ultimately, the election of Jimmy Carter, actually a moral person in the White House. Their point is that is what's happening to us now. We are starting to gather together to reminisce about those times. Wasn't the Christic Institute great? Wasn't that fun? Wasn't that great we got to do it? But what they've said is that just at that point in time, when the idealists are reminiscing and just beginning to suspect that their best days are behind them, it turns out that they discover that their best days are immediately in front of them. Because, as it turns out, because the previous generations refused to listen back during that decade and refused to amend the system, refused to re-infuse the system with the ideals that were being espoused by the idealist generation, the seeds of self-destruction were sown in the culture, and that those seeds would come to fruition when the idealists began to become 65, 68 years old, and that what would happen is a major crisis would descend upon the culture. And that the major crisis that occurred in the 16th century, as I said, was in fact the Glorious Revolution, the rising up against the royalists and the authoritarians in the churches, the ecclesial orders in Europe. The major secular crisis of the following generation was the American Revolution, the rising up against the king and the crown and establishing a natural law-based constitutional democracy in the New World. The major crisis of the following century was the American Civil War, an absolute total tragedy for the entire culture. The secular crisis of the following 100-year cycle was the 1929 Depression and the entire onset of World War II that went on for that entire period from 1929 all the way to 1945. And that period right where our people began to be born. Okay, the resolution of that particular secular crisis at the end of World War II is the age into which we were born. And we, like all other idealist generations, came to believe in these ideals of our culture, of our Western civilization, of our democratic social democracy. And that we went through the exact experience during that 10-year period, and we now are gathering together to come to see what the actual seeds that have been sown in our culture by the failure of previous generations to have adequately adhered to the ideals of our civilization. And what we're going to be seeing happening, as we now know that the capture of our government by the same robber barons that basically came to power at the end of the Civil War from 1868 to 1898, there's a period of time from 1868 to 1898 when the robber barons came to power, when they discovered the institution of the corporation. They discovered that they could have a new type of business combine where they could come together and all of these wealthy people could end up owning a company but not being liable for anything that it did. That they would share ownership of this company, they would sell shares to each other in this company, and those who held the shares were not liable in any way. And the corporation had the duty to maximize the profits that could be generated by that business, and then those profits could be distributed among the shareholders who were completely immunized against any liability. And the problem is that the corporation had no soul. That it had no soul. It had no conscience. It had no sense of a proper business person who would historically care about their customers, care about the quality of the product that they built, care about their reputation in the community for responsibility and participating in the public weal. But the corporations had no such sensibility at all. And the owners of those corporations began to seek out monopoly power and control, where they controlled all of the railroads, they owned all of the steel companies, they owned all of the petroleum companies. What they did is they began to join together in major combines of interlocking directorates, and there arose an entire era of robber barons in the country. So by 1898, you had between that period from 1893 to 1898, you had the United States taking over Hawaiian Islands, taking over the Philippines, taking over Cuba. They'd already taken over California. Then there was this entire period of manifest destiny. The idea that they, in fact, were in charge, that they had the right to take over anything they wanted. And that it was the white man's burden, it was their responsibility to take over and own the resources and to develop all of the resources. This is the era that we are all taught about from our high school civics classes all the way into college, that used to be like that. That it used to be like that. But thank goodness we've identified them and we've belled that cat, and now we're all better. Okay? Well, it turns out that particular robber baron group are the ones that came together not only in certain combines in the form of the corporations, but they formed private investment houses. They formed private investment houses where they came together to invest mutually in the same corporations and set up interlocking directorates. And in those private investment houses, such as Brown Brothers Harriman, for example, where E.H. Harriman, who owned the massive rail lines, joined together with John D. Rockefeller, that owned the Standard Oil of New Jersey and Standard Oil of California, and they brought in J.P. Morgan, and had the Morgan Guarantee Trust. That all these people, the DuPonts, they all sat down at a specific table together at the office of Brown Brothers Harriman. And it turns out that the CEO of Brown Brothers Harriman was George Herbert Walker. That sounds like a familiar name, doesn't it? But it's George Herbert Walker, the same George Herbert Walker who was the grandfather of George Herbert Walker Bush. The same person who was the great-grandfather of George W. Walker Bush. Okay? And it turns out that the CEO of that Brown Brothers Harriman was George Herbert Walker. And it turns out that these are the people that actually, between that period all the way up to into 1898, were behind the scenes goading the American government into doing all of these things of taking over Hawaii and taking over the Philippines and taking over Cuba. And it turns out that the Secretary of State, as of 1893, John W. Foster, was the Secretary of State during that time, who turns out just happens to be the grandfather of John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, who were the Secretary of State and the head of the Central Intelligence Agency under the Eisenhower administration. And it turns out that John W. Foster happened to be the father-in-law of Robert Lansing, who married his eldest daughter and was the Secretary of State for Woodrow Wilson during World War I. So at the end of World War I, he invited Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles to come to Versailles for the treaty negotiations with Germany, and actually put in the resolutions requiring the reparations be paid by Germany at the end of World War I, and then made them the lawyers for Germany. And people don't realize this. John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles were the lawyers for Germany to get paid back the reparations, and then they were the lawyers for Brown Brothers Harriman, as it turns out, in the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell. And what they did is they set up the agreement to give the loans. These industrialists gave the loans to Germany to pay the reparations that had been designed by their own lawyers. And that whole process began, and what they did then, interestingly enough, George Herbert Walker left as the CEO of Brown Brothers Harriman and turned the post over to Prescott Bush, who was his son-in-law. And George Herbert Walker then went and set up the Union Bank of New York, and they set up a subsidiary in the Netherlands called the Bank of Commerce and Shipping, run by a fellow by the name of Fritz somebody. Bottom line is, I don't remember everybody, but the bottom line is that they set up this bank, and they began depositing money in the bank and actually purchased the original headquarters for the Nazi Party in Germany. They actually created the Nazi Party in Germany. And from 1923, they funded Hitler all the way to 1933. And it turns out that John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles sat in the meeting in January of 1933, in which the decision was made to make Adolf Hitler the Chancellor of Germany. Okay? What I'm saying to you here is that these people are still with us. That these people set themselves up at that time, and that they were in power all the way till the end of World War I. And at the end of World War I, when they were funding the rise of Hitler, in 1917, the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsar in the Soviet Union, threw the Tsar out, and established the Soviet Union, set themselves up as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and they declared that they were going to be stopping the robber barons from their basic nation-state-based state capitalist imperialism. And that struggle went on from 1917 all the way to December 31st of 1991. That's the era that's important. That's a 75-year Cold War that was going on. And the fact of the matter is, the minute in October of 1917, when the Bolsheviks established the revolution and overthrew the Tsar, the Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, organized a foreign military expeditionary force and sent them into Russia, and actually aligned with the White Russians to try to crush the revolution inside the Soviet Union. That's how the whole Cold War started. Okay, so that operation has been going on, and what happened, according to my thesis, and I'm sharing with you now, I've spent years since 1992, when George H.W. Bush, on the same day that he issued the pardons to the first 6 guys indicted by Lawrence Walsh in the Iran-Contra case, and at the same day issued the order to the IRS to revoke the 501c3 tax-exempt charter for the Christic Institute. I have been busy studying this and researching this in the same way that we investigated the Contras, the same way that we investigated the Kerr-McGee Nuclear Corporation. We've been investigating these guys, and we've tracked them to their lair. And these people are the people that we're dealing with here. And what happened is that these people have mounted this war for 75 years to try to crush any type of democratic movement, any type of movement that interfered with their ability to lay claim to the natural resources of people throughout the world. That's why we were so puzzled as an idealist generation coming out into the world. How could it be possible that our government was supporting major fascists all through Latin America? Why is it they were crushing peasant movements for cooperatives in Central America? Why is it that they were supporting the overthrow of Allende? Why is it that they were supporting assassinations of Lumumba? Why is it that they were doing this? What we discovered is a very important thing. And I want to tell you one quick story. That when we filed the Iran-Contra case on May 28th of 1986, I sent Bill Taylor, our investigator, down to Miami. He filed the case at 4:30 in the afternoon, right? And on Friday afternoon, on the 28th of May. Monday morning, I'm in my office in Capitol Hill, And I get a telephone call, and it's James Lawrence King, the chief judge of the United States District Court for the Southern District of Florida in Miami, where we'd filed the case. He says, "Hello, Mr. Sheehan, this is James Lawrence King. I'm the chief federal judge. I decided I've taken your case because of the importance of the matters involved in it, and I'm going to summarily dismiss your case if you're not in front of me by 2 o'clock this afternoon here in Miami." Okay, so I jump into a suit, I run out and get a cab, and I run down to the airport, go down to Miami. I get a cab, I come hook sliding into his courtroom, and here I am in the courtroom at like 1:45, and here's James Lawrence King sitting on the bench, looking at his watch, waiting to see if I'm going to make it. And arrayed out in front of him are 29 lawyers, already in the box, retained to represent the other side. Okay? And James Lawrence King says to me, "Mr. Sheehan, I'm glad that you're here. I wanted to introduce you to the lawyers that are going to be representing the other side. We have here who's going to be representing Mr. Adolfo Calero, whom you assert in your complaint was the head of the FDN Contras. Who's going to be representing him is Mr. Anthony Lapham, and he's going to serve as chief counsel for the defendants." I said to myself, Anthony Lapham, why do I recognize his name? Well, it turns out I recognized his name because he was chief counsel for the Central Intelligence Agency under George Bush. When George H.W. Bush was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency under Jerry Ford from 1976 to 1977. Anthony Lapham was chief counsel for the CIA, and there he is representing Adolfo Calero. And the judge says to me, Mr. Sheehan, also here representing Mr. Ronald Joseph Martin, who is the owner of the Tamiami gun shop that you allege in your complaint was providing false end user certificates for all of the illegal weapons that were being shipped to the Contras. He said, and his lawyer is Mr. Williams here. You may recognize Mr. Williams' name as well, because Mr. Williams was in fact the chief of the criminal division of the United States Justice Department here in Miami until last Friday at 5 o'clock. At which point he decided he was going to retire and go into private practice and represent, and I said, professional criminals, Your Honor, I think is the term you're looking for. And he said, "That's enough, Mr. Sheehan. That's why I brought you down here." I said, "I've heard about you." He said, "And we're not going to have any of that in this case." He said, "And I'm telling you right now that I've placed this case under seal, and if you so much as breathe a word to anyone, anywhere in the world, that this case even exists, I'm going to put you in federal prison for 6 months." And I said, "Really?" I said, "Can you tell me on the basis of what authority you think you have the right to do that?" He said, "Well, you may not be familiar with the federal rules that we have down here in the Southern District of Florida." And I said, "Well, I assume they're the same federal rules as every other court, which my professor, Shapiro, actually drafted, and our class helped him draft them at Harvard Law School." I said, "I'm pretty familiar with those rules." I said, "So I assume you're asserting the discretion that a judge has to protect the integrity of a jury. But this is way beyond any discretion that you have to protect a jury, to shut down every breath of the existence of a case." He said, "Well, I just wanted you to be here in person so you'd know that you'd been warned." So I said, "Fine, are we done here?" He said, "We're done." So I turn around, walk out, I go back up, I get a cab, fly back up to Washington. The next day I go into my office and I call Russell Hemingway. Russ Hemingway is an old and very dear friend of ours, a close friend of John Kennedy's in the Navy. A very aristocratic, very bright guy, runs a thing called the Fund for an Effective Congress. Raises money for Congress people. He likes to joke about it. He says, "We provide money to liberals, whether they're Democrats or Republicans." And anyway, I call him up and I tell him what's happened. And he said, "Well, Dan," he said, I want you to go over and talk to Tip O'Neill. I'll give Tip a call. You go on over and talk to him." And Tip at the time was the Speaker of the House, right? So I go over there and I talk to Tip O'Neill. I explain to him what's happened. I show him a copy of the complaint. He said, "This is amazing." He said, "Look what you've got here." He said, "This is like these are impeachable offenses." I said, "Yes, that would be right." He said, "Well," he said, "we're in charge of the House of Representatives, and Peter Rodino is the chair of the Judiciary Committee still, the same one that returned the articles of impeachment against Nixon." He said, "But the Republicans hold the Senate. And as long as they hold the Senate, they won't ever do anything if we even return articles of impeachment." So I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do. I want you to go upstairs, and I want you to go up and see Claiborne Pell. Claiborne, the Democratic senator from Rhode Island, is the chairman or the ranking Democrat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And you talk to him, show him a copy of your complaint. I'll call him, tell him you're coming, and you tell him that you want an agreement that if the Democrats retake the Senate in the fall, that's 1986, in November, and this is now May of 1986, he said that you get a deal from him that if the Democrats take back the Senate, they'll convene a special select committee, and they'll investigate these very charges. He said, and he's going to ask you, he's going to say, Dan, who do you think should head that up? You tell him John Kerry. Tell him John Kerry. He loves John Kerry. We all kid him. He thinks John Kerry, we think it's his illegitimate son. He said he loves him so much. He thinks he's going to be president someday. I said, that's funny, so does John Kerry. And so he said, but you tell him that. So I go upstairs and we do it. I go through the whole thing. I tell him John Kerry. He said, great, we'll agree to do this, right? So I go back down. I come back. I leave the Hill and I go back over to our office. And Patty Austin, who's my secretary, comes up to me. She says, Danny, there's an elderly gentleman here waiting for you. And I said, really, who is he? She said, I don't know. He didn't give me his name. I said, well, where is he? She said, he's in your office waiting for you. I said, all right. So I go upstairs in the office, and there's this man there, about maybe 70-year-old guy, sitting there. And he reaches up and shakes my hand, and he says, hello. And I go and sit down. He said, Mr. Sheehan, he said, I'd like to ask you a couple questions. And I said, okay, what is it? He said, and he reaches into his briefcase. He pulls out a copy of the complaint. He says, I've got a copy of your complaint that you filed down in Miami last Friday. I didn't ask him how he got it. And he said, I just want to ask you a couple questions, and maybe I can help you here. He says, out of your 29 defendants, who do you think is the most important of all these defendants? I said, that's really easy. And he said, well, who is it? I said, it's Theodore G. Shackley. And he said, really? Why is that? I said, well, a lot of people would say it's because Theodore Shackley was the director of covert operations for the Central Intelligence Agency back in 1976 and 77 when George Bush, who's now vice president in charge of the 5412 Committee of the National Security Council, heading up covert operations, that he was in fact the head of covert operations for the CIA under George Bush. And he's the principal founder of the off-the-shelf enterprise. It's not Oliver North. It's Theodore Shackley, the head of covert operations for the CIA. And he said, yes, that's what people would say. He said to me, but that's not the reason why he's the most important for you? I said, no. I said, well, He said, well, what is the reason? And I said, because Theodore Shackley was the Miami station chief for the CIA on November 22nd of 1963. And he just looked at me, stunned, and he actually got tears in his eyes. He said, there aren't 5 people in the world that would have answered the question that way. And he comes over and he leans across my desk and puts out his hand, and he says, my name is Dick Billings. I was the chief staff writer for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. I think you and I can help each other out. That's how I started to hunt these guys. That's how I started to find out who these people are. Because what he said to me, he said, look, there's a man that you need to talk to that wants to talk to you. Will you agree to meet with him tomorrow? And I said, sure. He sets up the meeting. He said, tell me where you want to meet. I said, the Dubliner. We'll go to the Dubliner, nice Mick place, at the bottom of Capitol Hill, noontime tomorrow. So I go over there, and here's Dick Billings out front waiting for me. I walk up, I shake his hand, we walk in, and here's this guy, like a 70-year-old guy, sitting there all by himself at a table. We walk over to the guy, and Dick Billings walks over and he says, Dan Sheehan, Joe Smith. And I stick out my hand and say, yeah, right, good Joe Smith. He said, no, that's my name, Joseph Burkholder Smith. He said, I was the deputy CIA station chief in Mexico City back in 1973 and 74. He said, when Theodore Shackley became the head of Western Hemisphere operations for the CIA. And it's important that I talk to you about something. So I said, okay, tell me what it is. He said, when Theodore Shackley was removed from being the head of the CIA station in Saigon, where he ran the Phoenix assassination program, he was brought back to Washington and was made the head of the Western Hemisphere operations. And he removed every single one of the station chiefs all through South America and put in his own men. He was arguing that Phil Agee was writing a book about the agency inside the company, and that he may know who the names of these guys were, and they may be compromised. So Shackley has removed all of them, and he's appointed a new person to be the station chief here in Mexico City, a man by the name of Tom Polgar. And he said, Tom Polgar came into my office. Here I am sitting here with him at the Dubliner Cafe with Dick Billings here and Dick Billings there and this guy right there. And he says to me, Tom Polgar comes into my office and says, Joe, I don't know whether we're going to be leaving you on here as the deputy CIA station chief in Mexico City. It all depends on how you want to answer a few questions. There's going to be a guy coming in tomorrow morning about 10 o'clock in the morning. You'll recognize who he is. And he's going to have some questions for you. He may even want you to go somewhere and talk to some other people. And so the next morning, he said, I'm sitting in my office, and into the office walks Nasser Haro, who is the head of the DFS, which is in Mexico. It's like the FBI and the CIA combined. He comes into his office. He comes into my office, and he said, Tom Polgar said that you'd come with me and answer some questions for some people that I had to talk to. He said, okay, I'll go with you. So they go down, they get in a little Suburban, they go down to the Mexico City airport, they fly away, and they fly, and they end up landing in Rio, right? And they land in Rio de Janeiro. They land. He gets out of the plane. They get into a helicopter, go completely around security, get into a helicopter. They fly away, and he flies all the way into Argentina, goes all the way up to the northwesternmost corner where the 5 countries all come together at a little place called Salta, he said. We land on this like soccer field, he said, and I get out of the helicopter, and I follow Nasser Haro across the soccer field, and we go up this little embankment. I look over, and he said, I swear, I thought I was in Bavaria, he says. And I look over, and Nasser Haro takes me down into the little town. There's this little Bavarian inn, and we walk in, and there are these 6 men sitting at this table, and the big stone fireplace behind him, and on the mantelpiece, there's a big swastika flag. And they said to me, sit down, Joe. And he sits down, and he said, we've got to ask you some questions, and depending on how you answer these questions, it'll determine whether you're going to be left on as the CIA deputy station chief in Mexico City. So Joe said, well, what is it? The guy said, we have just gone to great lengths to create a new major cocaine cartel out of Medellin in Colombia. And this cocaine is going to be being shipped into the United States, and a portion of the profits are going to be used to help fund our war without boundaries against your enemies and ours. And we want to make certain that if you're left on as the deputy station chief, you won't do anything to interfere with this. And so, and Joseph Burkholder Smith said to me, and I swear to God, Dan, he said, I don't know what I'd ever done in my whole life that would have led them to believe that I would have gone along with that. And I said, how about being the deputy CIA station chief in Mexico City for a start? I said, and he was completely offended, and he got up from the table, and he said to Dick Billings, he said, I thought he was going to cooperate. And Dick said, hey, I just met him. And so the guy turns around and comes around the table to me, and he sticks out his hand, and I reach up to shake his hand, and he looks me in the eye, and he said, I just wanted to make sure that if you're going to be doing an investigation like this, you know exactly who you're dealing with. And he shook my hand and walked out. That's who we're dealing with. That's who we're dealing with. The people who created the Third Reich, the people who created the Nazi Party, the people who created that party as a bulwark against communism and socialism in Europe. This is the group. And the fact is that they have been secretly funding this covert operation ever since that period of time. They formed a major alliance with the Nazis. They established Reinhard Gehlen, who was the head of the SS, anti-Soviet and anti-Eastern Bloc intelligence, made him the head of German intelligence in West Germany. This is who we're dealing with here. So what I'm saying to you is we are dealing not with normal conservatives, we're dealing with reactionaries. We're dealing with people who are deeply imbued with a conviction that they have a right to get privileged access to the strategic raw materials of the world that they deem to be their right to control, and that they are working through major corporations through a set of major investment houses. They have the same kind of lawyers, and I know because I was there on Wall Street. I know what these lawyers are like. And so what I'm saying to you is that this is the situation that we face as the secular crisis of this century now comes upon us. And we now know from just the release just on the 30th of March, we know of the International Panel on Climate Change has just issued its 5th report, and they're a fairly conservative group. And what they're telling us, here are some quotes. They say that you have to be ready for the coming breakdown of the human food system due to heating, drought, flooding, and major precipitation extremes of drought and flood. Between 2014 and 2100, there will be 2 billion new mouths to feed, and we're going to have 5 times the number of extreme weather incidents. There's going to be an increase in violence due to conflicts and civil war over the arable land that remains. We are all sitting ducks, said the author of the report, Professor Michael Oppenheimer of Princeton. And they're anticipating a rise from 7 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit between now and the year 2100. And the rising of 10 degrees Fahrenheit is going to cause a series of, and the thing to remember is that this is being done with full knowledge. The federal government is passing laws under the whip hand of these financial interests that are actually affirmatively authorizing these people to pump this sludge into our environment. Millions of tons of carbon into the environment, millions of tons of pollutants under the Clean Air Act, they call it. And what they're saying is that even though the International Panel on Climate Change 5 years ago called for and demand that there be a reduction in the annual output of global greenhouse gas emissions to reduce by 70% the annual global greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2020 below the amounts that were being emitted in 2001. And even though they called for a 70% reduction, the United States Congress has passed resolutions allowing only 7% reduction, which means that they're allowing, by affirmative legislation, the major corporations to pump this stuff into the atmosphere, pawning off their costs onto the community, contaminating the atmosphere, contaminating the rivers and streams. And so that there's millions of tons being put out into the atmosphere. And we know that with the rising of the global mean temperature of the planet by 7 to 10 degrees by the year 2100, we know that it's melting the major polar ice caps. We all know this. They're showing it on the television all the time, that the ice is melting and that we can see it melting. And the fact of the matter is that 75% of all of the fresh water on our planet is in the ice caps. This is where the rivers flow from, that flow south from the north down through the rivers of the northern hemisphere and flow from the South Pole all the way up to the equator. This is the source of the fresh water on our planet, 75% of it, and it is melting. And not only that, but it's all that fresh water going into the ocean. That's not what's making the oceans rise. What's making the oceans rise is the increase in the temperature. The water coming out of the ice fields and in the ice caps going into the ocean, what it's doing is it's diluting the oceans. It's diluting the salt water. It's lowering the salt content of the water, therefore decreasing the density of the ocean. And what's happening is the underwater warm water currents across the planet are starting to rise to the surface because of the decrease in density of the water. And they're starting to rise to the surface where they will dissipate. And that we will then lose the North Pacific Drift, the Gulf Stream. They are stopping a process called thermohaline circulation on our planet. And when those underwater currents are dispersed, we are going to lose the temperate zone on our planet. That is what causes the temperate zone, that area between 24 degrees north latitude and 66 degrees north latitude and south latitude, where 90% of all the food on the planet is grown in those regions. Okay? and that's what's happening, and the temperature change of the ocean is killing off the plankton. And the plankton are the very root of the food chain. That the larger fish that eat the plankton and the bigger fish eat the other fish. That whole chain, the food chain, is being destroyed by the increasing temperature and the alteration in the salination levels of the sea. And not only, that is also, as you know, because of the heat, the increased heating, it excites the molecules of the ocean, of the water, and they start to expand. That's what causes the expansion of the ocean. And they are now anticipating from 24 inches to 39 inches of global mean sea rise across the planet by the year 2100. And what that means, now people say, oh, well, 24 inches, it's, I go out and I can measure 24 inches up on the beach, it doesn't hurt anything. That is going to cause inundation up to 20 miles from the shorelines, all across the world. And it turns out that over 53% of the American population lives within 40 miles of the shorelines in our country. And much of the industry is there. But very importantly, not only will the actual continuation of the present levels of global greenhouse gas emissions cause the rising in the global sea levels for 24 to 39 inches, but what it will do, if it goes on up until the year 2100, it will lock in the later sea rise of 23 feet in the 22nd century. And this is absolute total catastrophe for the human family, because just the inundation up to 20 miles is going to contaminate the salt water, by salt water, the fresh water, the aquifers, up to 30 miles from the shorelines. And so when you destroy 75% of the fresh water on the planet, the available drinking water for the rivers and the source of rejuvenation of the rivers, and you only have 25% left, and you contaminate the first 30 miles of that on all the shorelines across the whole planet, you're losing another 1/3 of the remaining 25%. So you're actually getting down now to only 15% of the remaining fresh water on the entire planet. And now what they're doing is engaging in fracking. That they're coming into the heartland of the country, in the Dakotas, all through the Dakotas in the Midwest and into Pennsylvania, and they're fracking. And what they're doing is they're driving poisons down into the ground, poison chemicals down into the ground inside of these concrete tubes. And they're blowing out all the seams and pulling the oil and the natural gas out of there. And what they're doing is they're leaving that poison inside those concrete columns. And then walking away and capping them and walking away from those fields. How long do people think those concrete tubes are going to stay intact? That we've talked to experts, Sarah and I were up in North Dakota talking with the people doing this. They feel terrible, but they're still doing it. And the fact is, they know that within 40 years, all of those concrete tubes are going to disintegrate and pour all of those poison chemicals into the water table up there and destroy the Ogallala aquifer. Okay, that those are the kind of things that are happening, and that we also know that of the 435 private nuclear power plants in the country, or in the world, 435 nuclear power plants, 400 of them are right on the seacoast, because they're using the water from the ocean to cool the reactors, just like at Fukushima. And so when you have 20 miles of inundation taking place between now and the 2100, you've got 400 private nuclear reactors with full nuclear piles operating in that area. Okay? So that we're looking at potentially 400 Fukushimas between now and the year 2100. Okay? So these are the and on top of that, for those of you who are not awake yet, there actually is causing the thawing of the permafrost areas of the planet along the Arctic and the Antarctic Circle. And in fact, there's 50 billion tons of methane gas is locked in under those permafrosts. And in fact, the methane, when released in the plumes, actually is 20 times more powerful as a global greenhouse gas than is carbon monoxide. Okay? And so we're facing a massive increase in the storms. I mean, CNN loves tracking these storms around like it's a game. Oh, look, there's a huge global cold mass coming down into Alabama. It's probably the best thing that's happened to Alabama in years. But the fact of the matter is they've got huge storms happening. There are massive thunderstorms occurring. Tornadoes, 25 tornadoes in one night in Alabama. And they're all covering it like, this is news. We haven't seen this before. And now this is the what they're really looking at, according to the International Panel on Climate Change. What we're looking at is, as they list them, major economic collapse. That as the crops fail, as the mass exits from the industrial zones along the coast, by the year 2050, 50% of the entire human family will live within 40 miles of the seacoasts. And that all of these people between 2050 and 2100 are going to have to be evacuated from these areas that are flooding out and contaminating their water tables. Okay? The agricultural crops are going to be killed off. The amount of water available is going down. So all of these things begin to occur, and you say to yourself, let me see, what do we think it's going to be like when that is happening? And what do we think that the major authorities are going to do about it? And this is what brings us to the second half of this, which will be quick, because you know how bad it is. That you've heard lots and lots of talk recently about the NSA and the fact that it's wiretapping all the telephones and it's recording all the telephone conversations and all of your emails and all of your Facebook pictures that you're sending. They're just storing them all. They're keeping them all for later consultation if they decide they want to look at them for whatever reason. And so you've heard a lot about that. You've heard about a lot of talk about torture. A lot of talk about torture. Let me see, is waterboarding someone until they're gagging and passing out, dying, thinking they're drowning, is doing that to them 100 times, is that torture or is it not? Okay? And the major media are discussing this like it's a legitimate question. You know, what do you think about that? We all call in. Here, call 26547 if you think it is, and 2549 if you think it ain't. And of course, all of this it leads to the passage of the National Defense Authorization Act in 2011. And you get 16 Democratic senators joining with all the Republican senators in voting for this. And when we heard that it was coming on in the House, the American Civil Liberties Union said, wait a second, just because the crazies are proposing something like, having a bill that authorizes the United States military to arrest an American citizen here inside the United States without any probable cause to believe they've committed any offense at all, but just because they have reasonable grounds to suspect that you may be providing substantial assistance to a group that the federal executive branch has unilaterally designated as an organization that has hostile intentions toward the United States or any of its allies. Okay? That we can arrest that person, we can incarcerate that person. She gets no attorney, no notice to her family as to where they've taken her. That she can be held completely indefinitely. She's not allowed to have any lawyer, even if they hire one and send one to the jail to try to find him, actually to the military stockade where they're being held, okay, by the military. The lawyer cannot see them or contact them. And they can be put in front of a military tribunal and confronted without any lawyer, no right to appear in front of any judge, even if a lawyer shows up and files a motion in a federal court for habeas corpus, one of the most basic rights in our Constitution, the right to be brought in front of an objective, impartial magistrate to determine whether or not there's probable cause to believe they've committed a crime. Why wouldn't they bring him in front of a judge? Because they don't have to have probable cause. All they have to have is reasonable suspicion that you may have provided some kind of substantial assistance to one of these groups. Okay? And the fact of the matter is, they then put you in front of the military tribunal, and you can be confronted by witnesses that you have no right to cross-examine. And they can produce evidence that they don't even have to tell you what the evidence is, so you can't even challenge it. because it violates national security to let you know what the evidence is. It could compromise the sources of our information that we have against you. And you can be convicted by a non-unanimous vote of the military panel and, in fact, incarcerated for the rest of your life with no appeal to any civilian court. So we said to ourselves, that can't be true. That can't be happening here in the United States. And just because there's a few loonies among the House of Representatives that's introducing a bill like that, there's no chance that that's going to pass. Well, in comes John Boehner and says, well, look at, I guess if the loonies want this, we have to give them something, so maybe they'll vote for us next time on something. And so the Republicans all go along with it. And it turns out the Democrats, afraid that they're going to be charged with not being adequately hard on terrorists, rush right in and endorse it. And so it passes the House of Representatives. ACLU, totally surprised. Oh, this is a big surprise. The Senate will never allow it. Senate will never allow it to pass. Comes before the Senate. 16 Democrats join together with the Republicans and they pass it. Oh, well, Obama's never going to sign it. Obama won't sign this. Okay? Obama, on New Year's Eve of 2011, at 11:55 at night, comes into the Oval Office while everybody is jumping up and down in Times Square, and signs it into law at 11:55. And bang, there it is. Okay? And so immediately, Christopher Hedges and Dan Ellsberg and a bunch of others join with ACLU, and they rush into the federal court in New York. They file a major complaint against it. And Judge Catherine Forrest takes the case in front of her, an Obama-appointed federal judge, and she says, okay, look, I'm not sure you guys have standing here because it's not likely that they're going to arrest you guys for this. Here's the United States Attorney over here. Mr. United States Attorney, I'd like you to stand up and in defense of your statute, tell us all that there's no reasonable chance that any of these people would ever be charged with giving substantial aid to any one of these hostile organizations. I'm sorry, Your Honor, I can't do that. I can't assure them that they won't be arrested. I can't assure them that they won't be prosecuted because I'd have to see what the article was that they wrote to see whether we deemed it to be a substantial assistance to such a hostile organization. She says, that's it. She declares it unconstitutional. Goes to the Court of Appeals. Court of Appeals, these people do not have standing because we don't believe that the U.S. government's ever going to really arrest these people. So they don't have adequate standing. And so immediately it comes to mind the words of Reverend Nienoy, Martin Nienoy, back in 1937 in Germany, when he was taken to the concentration camp. And he said famously, in Germany in the 1930s, when they passed the laws and came and took the communists, I was not a communist, so I did not speak up. Then they came and arrested the socialists. I was neither a socialist, so I still did nothing. Then they came for the trade unionists. And I was not a trade unionist, so I did nothing. And then they came for the Jews. I was a Christian, a Protestant. I was not a Jew, so I did nothing. And then they came for me. And there was no one left to stand up for me. That's what's happening now. The allowance of these types of statutes, these types of regulations to be going after people who they say are the Muslims, the terrorists, that's not us. We're not going to be those people. When you come in front of a federal court as a person like Christopher Hedges or Dan Ellsberg, who is a critic of the unlawful and unjust American policies, and the U.S. Attorney stands up in front of the judge and says that he will not assert that they aren't going to be subject to arrest and detention under this statute, and the Federal Court of Appeals refuses to protect them. That's the condition that we're in right now. And so people say to themselves, well, wait a second, what's this got to do with terrorism? So okay, we have a lot of disruption. We have lots of flooding going on. We have 20 miles of territory flooded out. We have major nuclear reactors underwater, and they're running out of control. People are all kind of crazy running around. People are fleeing from the shorelines. They're moving inland into other people's property and territory who are arming themselves to protect their property. People are arming themselves to get property. People are arming themselves to get water. Okay? What happens? The United States decides, the United States law enforcement people have access to everybody's emails. They have access to everybody's phone calls, everybody's cell phones. They got access to everybody's photographs in their YouTube or whatever they are, and they've got them all. And so the question is, do we think they're going to look? When they say, I'd never do that. I promise I'd never do that. Well, it turns out the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act that was passed that gave them their first authority to wiretap telephones without any probable cause to believe that a crime had been committed. They lowered the Fourth Amendment standard in that case to allow the federal government to engage in surveillance of telephone conversations merely on the suspicion that information of importance to the national security of the United States might possibly be discussed. And it turns out that in 2002, in the first full year after W. Bush came into office, the federal courts reviewed this, and it turns out that there were 75 separate instances where information that had been secured without a warrant under this auspices of foreign intelligence surveillance, 75 instances in which that information was turned over to federal law enforcement officials for regular criminal law enforcement. And so there's not any doubt whatsoever what these people will do when this comes to pass. When these consequences start to befall us, and they have this tool in hand, there's no doubt about what it is they're going to do. And so what I'm saying, we need to organize here in Santa Cruz. What we need to do is we need to organize ourselves and go to the city councils and demand that the city council, yes, love? I think she's concerned about the time. Okay, the bottom line is that what we've got to do is go to our city council. We've got to demand that they pass a resolution declaring the city of Santa Cruz to be a constitutional protection zone. That not only will they follow the statute that's been passed by the state legislature. You remember the state legislature has passed a statute that says that they don't want to allow any law enforcement officers in the state of California to actively participate in enforcing the National Defense Authorization Act. They've actually passed such a statute. But the fact of the matter is, what we've got to do is we've got to be protected by our law enforcement people against people coming in attempting to exercise absolutely, totally unconstitutional authority, to take our citizens into custody and take them into trials with no lawyers, with no constitutional rights, and to be incarcerated forever. That we cannot allow that to happen. We have to get this resolution passed in the form of a statute, not a resolution saying we don't like that statute, not a resolution saying we prefer that statute wasn't there, but to say that we are instructing our law enforcement officers to use all force necessary to protect our people against any federal agent that comes into our city and attempts to enforce the National Defense Authorization Act. And then we have to go to our county, to our Board of Supervisors, and get them to pass the identical resolution. Then we have to go to our state assembly district and get that passed. And we need to go to our state senate area and get that passed. Well, then we have to go to our congressional district and get a resolution, a statute passed. And then what we have to do is we have to lobby like mad to start with our state legislature to try to get them to gear up their statute that they've already passed and to put more teeth in it to actually order the state law enforcement people to use all force necessary to protect our people against any federal agent enforcing that statute in our state. And if they do not do that, what we have to do is we have to undertake an initiative. We've got to put an initiative on the ballot. Put an initiative on the ballot to, just like we have in California before, and to condemn and to stop the use of the National Defense Authorization Act in this state, and to order, on the part of our people, order our law enforcement officials to use all necessary force to protect our people in the state of California against that. Okay? And we have to do the exact same thing with regard to the fracking inside this state. We have to not allow this. We do not need to stand by wringing our hands and whining over the fact that people who are paid by the major corporations to fill those seats in the legislatures aren't helping us. Okay? We've got the power here in the state of California to move district by district by district to get these resolutions put into place, and then to move in to have a full-scale initiative on the ballot to declare that this is a constitutionally protected zone of the state of California, and that there will be no fracking allowed in the state either. And what I'm saying is that is how we do it. We mobilize in the same way that they did under the Chautauqua movement. The Chautauqua movement is the movement that was generated to confront the robber barons back in the 19th century, that generated the federal labor movement, the women's suffrage movement, all those other movements I told you about, that we need to organize our people. We need to stand up. We've got very clear marching orders here as to what to do. And we can do it district by district by district until the whole state is controlled by these rules, okay? And in fact, we can call upon Jerry Brown. There are two things that we know are true in closing. We know Jerry Brown is going to be elected governor for a fourth term on November 4th. We know that to be true. We also know, virtually certainly, that Hillary Clinton is going to be elected president in 2016. We know both of those things. The question is, how do we use both of those realities to get where we want to go? What we need to do is put maximum pressure on Jerry to do the right thing, to have the entire state of California made into a template of ecological security, no fracking, to do all the things to make his last term a legacy for him, and to stand above all the other governors in the state, or all the other governors in the country, and declare the state of California to be a constitutional protection zone and a no fracking zone. And that we've got to have him stand up and take a national stage. Take a national stage as the governor of California, advocating that the other governors of the other states around the country do the same thing. That what we've got to do, the Chautauqua movement was the one that went out around and attempted to establish what they called college-level consciousness. College-level consciousness among the workers of the country. We have to have our country have California consciousness. We've got to establish this consciousness here in the state of California of no National Defense Authorization Act, no fracking, and California will lead the way across the country to get this done across our country. That's what we need to do. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.